The mission of the nonprofit that I founded, Task Force Butler Institute, is simple. Make it difficult and expensive to be a neo-Nazi. We do that by gathering evidence through open source intelligence methods. We collect it, analyze it, and build cases. Then we publish reports that don't just expose individuals, but also explain the context of their words and actions so that they can be successfully prosecuted and found liable for hate crimes. Harassment campaigns, physical assaults, property destruction, the real-world harm that these groups cause is what we hold them accountable for. And we've been effective. No institutional funding, no full-time staff, no safety net. Just people doing this work in their spare time because it matters. But right now, the world feels upside down. The same tactics that we use to hold extremists accountable are being used against our friends and colleagues, people doing work just like us. They're baseless accusations, but real criminal investigations. And though the cases will likely collapse in court if a judge doesn't throw them out right away, that's not the point. The process is the punishment. Even if you win, you lose time, you lose money, you lose focus, things that you can't get back. And you carry the stress of being targeted by the very same system that you were trying to support. As I'm recording this, the Southern Poverty Law Center, or SPLC, has just been indicted for their work infiltrating and reporting on neo-Nazi organizations. One of the most effective counter-extremism organizations in the country. An organization that didn't just work alongside the FBI, it helped train the FBI. And now it's being accused of fraud for doing the exact work that law enforcement has relied on for decades. Former FBI Director James Comey has also just been indicted for posting a photo of seashells in the shape of the numbers 8647. That's the whole case. What the Trump administration considers a credible threat to the president's life. And the current FBI Director, Kash Patel, someone I've personally watched stand on stage at a QAnon conference, shoulder to shoulder with people calling for violence against their fellow Americans, he says he spent months investigating those seashells. At the same time, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, he just went on 60 Minutes and told Americans that the SPLC funded the Unite the Right neo-Nazi riot in Charlottesville to the tune of millions of dollars as part of a conspiracy to make him look bad during his first administration. The indictment and all of the messaging from Trump's former personal attorney, Todd Blanche, who's now the acting Attorney General of the United States, is that violent white extremism doesn't actually exist, that it's all a fraud, propped up by the SPLC and others who, in reality, risk their lives to keep Americans safe from terrorist organizations. I've infiltrated these groups. I've sat in their chats for months on end. I've gone to their events. I've tracked their plans. I've recorded their calls. I've been targeted with swattings, with death threats. I've received DOJ victim notification letters warning me that credible threats were made against my life. As I've said on this show before, a neo-Nazi hand-delivered a death threat to my mother's house on camera, and I spent over a year and countless days in court to see him put in jail. I can tell you, it wasn't the SPLC doing that. Today's guest, Tim Heaphy, is a former U.S. attorney for the Western District of Virginia. He was the lead investigative counsel for both the Charlottesville neo-Nazi rally of 2017 and the January 6th insurrection. He's seen all of the same things that I have, and definitely much more. And despite all of that, he still believes the system works, that in a few years we can rebuild what's been broken and get things back on track. I'm not sure I agree. So this conversation is about that question. Is the system fixable? Or are we already past that point? I'm Kris Goldsmith, and this is On Offense. Now let's get into it. Tim Heaphy, thanks so much for joining us on Offense. You are the author of We Are the Answer, How to Save Our Democracy, due out in bookstores in just a couple of weeks. You're someone who worked to investigate the events of the Charlottesville Unite the Right neo-Nazi riot and January 6th, which are events that I have been studying for years. Leading up to January 6th, I was infiltrating groups like the 3% Security Force and other extremist organizations. So it was an event that I saw coming. But rather than talk about history, I want to talk about the now. In the last week, since we're recording this, we've seen both the SPLC and James Comey indicted. Can you tell us what your thoughts were when James Comey was indicted?
Yeah, I can say, look, before I investigated the Charlottesville and the Jan 6 events, I was a U.S. attorney. I was President Obama's U.S. attorney in the Western District of Virginia, and we made decisions, Kris, based on the facts and the law without regard to politics. So this is clearly, both of these cases are clearly retributive, not guided by facts and law, but rather by a personal agenda of the President of the United States. It's shocking, it's discouraging, it's a threat to the rule of law, and it won't stand, right? Like, I don't think either of those cases actually have a valid theory or evidentiary basis. I expect both of them to be dismissed, or if they go beyond a judge, to result in not guilty findings. But that doesn't matter to this executive. They want to rattle the saber at their enemies using the Justice Department as a weapon. So I'm horrified by it.
Can you tell us about how an investigation affects a target like this? What is the SPLC going to? You were a prosecutor. What is the SPLC going to experience? What is former Director Jim Comey going to experience, even though these things don't have merit?
Yeah, there are tremendous consequences just with the allegation, even if there's no basis, if it ultimately results in a dismissal. There are real consequences. Start with the stress, right? Jim Comey was a prosecutor, was director of the FBI, and for him to be at the defense table in a courtroom is outrageous. And while the case has no merit, it's still stressful for him. There's the time and the aggravation and the expense. There is the expense of hiring counsel. SPLC and Jim Comey will have a lot of goodwill among lawyers around the country and will get a lot of offers of assistance because they're kind of cause celebs, and a lot of people see this as an overreach by the department. So they'll have plenty of assistance to fight the charges. But your question is exactly right, Kris, because there is a consequence already of just being accused. And look, I think that's the point. I think the point here is intimidation. Hey, if you are an enemy of us, we are coming after you, which is meant to discourage people from speaking up, speaking truth. That's what happens in autocracies, not what happens in democracy.
Have you had the opportunity to read either of the indictments?
I read the Comey indictment. It's very short. It's literally like a page and a half. The SPLC indictment I am familiar with, didn't read every word, but both of them are based on flawed theories. Mm-hmm. You know, the definition of a true threat recently articulated by the Supreme Court in this Colorado case in 2023, there has to put people in reasonable fear of their bodily safety, and this vague picture of seashells on the beach, which Jim Comey has credibly said he certainly didn't mean as a reference to violence, I just don't think meets the standard of a true threat. So that one seems just patently almost absurd on its face. And then the SPLC case, right, the notion that they are misleading donors by saying they're fighting white supremacy when they're paying money to informants who are members of white supremacist groups, that's how this works. That's how law enforcement has operated for years. And it's nothing inconsistent about the representation that they're fighting against hate because they are simultaneously providing assistance to people who are involved in those organizations. And then the money laundering theory relies on underlying crime. And if there isn't any underlying fraudulent representation, there's no money laundering. So again, I think both of these cases will collapse. They're not cases that, based on what I've seen, will survive an honest assessment of fact and law.
What Donald Trump says is taken as gospel. You write in your book about how it is your belief that the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and the thousands of people who showed up on January 6th genuinely held the belief that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, despite the fact that there was zero evidence. They just believed Donald Trump. This past weekend, as we're recording this, Donald Trump did an interview with 60 Minutes, where he said that the Unite the Right rally was funded to the tune of millions of dollars by the SPLC.
I see these no kings, which are funded just like the Southern Law was funded. You saw all that. Southern Law is financing the KKK and lots of other radical, terrible groups. And then they go out and they say, oh, we've got to stop the KKK. And yet they give them hundreds of thousands and even millions of dollars. It's a total scam run by the Democrats. It shows you that, like Charlottesville was all funded by the Southern Law. That was a Southern Law deal, too. And it was done to make me look bad, and it turned out to be a total fake. It basically was a rigged election. This was a part of the rigging of the election, and that's what you really should be doing. I mean, I hope one of your 60-minute episodes, which really hasn't changed very much from the last few years, I'm surprised, but one of those episodes should be on Southern Law and the fact that they spent millions and millions of dollars on absolute far right and just bad groups. And then they'd use those groups and they'd say, these are Republican groups and we're coming to your rescue. And they're the ones that have funded it, and they're the ones that keep them going.
What effect is Trump's baseless allegation going to have on the SPLC, on the FBI, who the SPLC was providing information to, and to ongoing efforts to hold accountable those the neo-Nazis and other white nationalists who did organize the Unite the Right rally with the intent to cause harm?
Yeah, it has a direct effect. First of all, it's ridiculous. He funded August 11th and 12th in Charlottesville. Patently absurd. The SPLC was actively mining their sources for information that was then fed to law enforcement. They have been an ally of the FBI, of law enforcement, providing really valuable intelligence about white supremacy and violent protest. Right? That's how this works. You can't possibly get information about what these nefarious groups are up to without infiltrating them or without actually getting inside of the planning and the discourse online or in person. So what he said on 60 Minutes, again, no connection to reality. But it has a huge impact because so many people, we heard in our investigation of the Capitol attack, pay very close attention to what he says and take it literally. When he says the election was stolen, there's systemic fraud in these states, people believe that, even absent any actual evidence to support that. So if the president lies to the American people, at least some portion of them take that as the evidence, right? His statement. And that's dangerous. That has real consequence. It had real consequence on January 6th. It'll have real consequence with respect to these new allegations about the SPLC. But what it also does is it sort of solidifies support on the other side. So what I expect to happen with SPLC is, yes, they're maligned by the President of the United States, facing a criminal charge. That is going to create a surge of support for them by other people who strongly disagree with the fact that they've been targeted. It's the polarized world in which we live, Kris. Like one allegation that attracts some repels others, and we just get increasingly divided.
As you're watching the president continue to lie and create these false narratives that are going to cause real harm to our democracy, what do you feel about the journalists who are doing these interviews who don't push back? I mean, you write a lot about anger being a motivating factor for folks, both for good and bad. A lot of civil rights legislation that we just saw, the SCOTUS destroy the Voting Rights Act. Righteous anger has accomplished a lot. What is righteous anger doing right now for you when you see journalists fail to hold the president to account when he's lying to their faces?
Yeah, I don't know that I agree with your premise that journalists are not holding him to account. I think there are a lot of journalists who are working very hard to identify these lies, to confront him with the lies. They are now demonized, just like the Biden Justice Department or state officials who certified the election, as somehow enemies of the state. Like the world in which he lives is, if you're against me, then you're somehow you're an enemy. So I don't know that the press is not holding him to account. I think the problem that we have, and I talk about this in the book, is that we increasingly in America, more and more people get their information from curated, algorithm-driven social media platforms, which, as you know, only reinforce your original perspective. If you're only getting to a news source because it pops up on your feed on X or on Instagram or on YouTube, then you're only getting one side of the information that corresponds to content with which you engaged previously. So more and more people in this country live in these kind of echo chambers, and this happens across the political spectrum, where they're really not getting balanced sources of information. They're getting kind of one side of the story. There are very few sources that give you a more balanced or long-form, nuanced development of topics. So that's dangerous, in my view. Like when I grew up, Kris, like there were 3 TV networks and a daily newspaper, and everybody kind of consumed the same basic information. Now, there's a spectrum of available news from lots of different perspectives, and increasingly people are only staying in their lane, and that to me is dangerous. So I don't know that I blame the media for that. Those are market-driven forces. Now, I think we need to help people navigate that. We need to flag for them how information is reaching them and help them be better consumers of information. So it's not the press's job to do that. It's our job to create an information ecosystem where people are more informed. Because again, I think we live in these just fundamentally different universes with respect to facts that we credit.
You write in your book about how Eric Holder has served as a role model for you. And he wrote after the latest election of Donald Trump that the cavalry is not coming, hoping to wake people up who've thought that the Constitution was going to stop Donald Trump, or the Electoral College was going to stop Donald Trump. Do you think that there is a realistic world where J.D. Vance presides over the counting of the Electoral College and he lets a Democrat come into office? If we have a free and fair election, Democrats have won. Do you see J.D. Vance not going along with a conspiracy like they tried, like people around Trump tried in 2020 to bring fake slates of electors?
Yeah. I think the rule of law, thankfully, still matters. And there may be attempts to challenge certified slates of electors, much like there was back in 2021. But the rules, my strong belief is that if people are engaged and if we elect people, if everybody in America pays attention, then it doesn't matter what J.D. Vance thinks or does, because the system, the guardrails will hold. J.D. Vance will preside over a congressional certification, so it's Congress that will decide. And if we have members of Congress who are going to apply the law, then it won't matter what he attempts to do. The rules will matter. After the January 6th investigation concluded, one of the practical things that we changed, or that the members of Congress changed upon our recommendation, was making clear that the Electoral Count Act gives the vice president a very ministerial role in the joint session. He or she essentially has to simply accept certified slates sent to Congress by states. Elections are run by states in this country. That's fundamental. It's part of our constitutional system. So this notion that the vice president can pick and choose between competing slates, hopefully that has been foreclosed by the modified Electoral Count Act. Vice president's role is very limited. Now, again, it doesn't mean that there won't be some attempt to circumvent that. But if Congress does its job and faithfully applies the law, then I think we're fine.
You write about Holder quite a bit. Can you tell us what else you've learned from him?
Yeah, Eric was a mentor to me and remains a good friend to me. I was an assistant U.S. attorney as a young lawyer, and the first day that I was sworn in to that position as a junior federal prosecutor, Eric was the U.S. attorney in D.C. who hired me, and he sat me down in his office, and he said, I don't have a lot of rules for you, a lot of do's and don'ts, but I have one rule that you have to keep in mind as an assistant U.S. attorney at all times. Do the right thing. He said, you're going to be entrusted with immense discretion in this job. You speak for a higher calling, a broader purpose, and I'm trusting that you're going to be fair, you're going to be just. That means you don't always do the most aggressive or prosecutorial thing. Sometimes that means you back off of cases or you let things go. And that stuck with me, and that's how he approached his job as U.S. attorney, his job as attorney general, how he's approached his life. And I always give that same speech to young lawyers that I have hired. You've got to be guided by sort of an internal compass about what's fair. And that manifested, Kris, in lots of different ways. There were times where I disappointed police officers by not pursuing a case, or I said to a victim, I'm not sure that you got this right. We have other evidence that suggests that maybe there's some uncertainty about who robbed you. But you got to have a moral compass and a broader sense of fairness when you're entrusted with that kind of discretion. And Eric kind of really reinforced that for me. So he's somebody that throughout my life has been a role model.
We've seen Saturday night massacres kind of multiple times over the last not even year and a half. Do you believe that there is going to be enough left at the DOJ for us to kind of recover in the next administration? I get from reading your book, I think that you're someone who truly believes in institutions. But I wonder about the personal impact that former AUSAs are having as they're leaving, as they've been burned by the government. Yes, it's the Trump administration, but if they don't see safety for themselves and their families, do you think that the current cadre of qualified people are going to be willing to go back into government? Because we've had now, quite a bit of a back and forth between the first Trump administration, Biden, and now the second. And the second has been far, far worse.
Yeah.
Do you think that there are enough qualified individuals and the capacity for Congress for things like confirmations to repair this?
Yeah, I think it's going to take a while, and I think it's a rebuild effort. But yeah, I am confident that if, regardless of which party controls, if we have at least a restoration of an independent Justice Department that is going to make its prosecutive decisions based on facts and law, that will be attractive to a lot of people. I think right now, the current department, there is a lot of offices are having trouble actually filling slots. There are a lot of people that don't want to serve in this administration because of some of the kinds of retributive priorities and cases that they've pursued. So I don't know that right now they are attracting kind of the same caliber of applicant that the department has traditionally attracted. But I think that will change, and this isn't really Republican or Democrat. It's institutionalist versus somebody that will misuse the department. I do think there's a lot of effort right now going on about what should a reconstituted Justice Department look like. Almost sort of a Project 2025 kind of process to say, okay, if there is a restoration of an independence of the department, what should that look like? And listening to some of the people involved in that, I think that they're going to be not only prioritizing hiring, but looking at maybe codifying some of the norms that have protected the department's independence through the years. So a lot of when I was a prosecutor and a U.S. attorney, a lot of the independence I had was just sort of a product of tradition. Mm-hmm. You know, when I went to the White House, when I was really recently confirmed as a U.S. attorney and met with President Obama with like 50 of us new U.S. attorneys, he came out into that room and he said, "You're not my lawyers. You should never make a decision based on what you think is best for me or for the administration. You should be primarily focused on the people of your district." And it didn't really strike me as anything unusual because that's kind of how it was always, regardless of who was president or who was attorney general. But that was a norm, Kris, not a law. So what we might do is put some things in place to prevent a rogue executive who doesn't respect those norms, to make it harder for him or her to violate that. So let's codify the White House contacts policy. Let's give federal prosecutors more civil service protection and make it harder to fire them for political reasons. Like there are some new rules that would take these things that were just traditions because they were good practice that thankfully were observed by parties, Republicans or Democrats, and maybe give them some teeth or some enforceability. So I think all that will help. And I think that it is such a high-minded mission that there will be a lot of good lawyers attracted to it if we have leadership that restores that integrity and that independence.
Do you think the federal government is going to need to be purged? Again, kind of in a very similar way to the way that Donald Trump has purged it of professionals, of people with experience, and now he's filling it with lackeys, with people. There's a bunch of AUSAs who've been filing briefs that are completely absurd. Is the next administration, whether it's Democrat or Republican, that's connected to reality, are they going to have to do a massive purge of the federal government? So are we going to have to start with even lower numbers than Trump is going to leave us with?
Yeah, I doubt it, candidly. I don't know that there'll be a massive purge. I do think there will be an elevated standard of quality and of capability. And if there are federal government lawyers, AUSAs or otherwise, that don't meet that standard, then I think there will be consequences. I think we move from politics as the criteria that gets and keeps those jobs to more merit-based and more willingness to adhere to those principles of independence and of being guided by the facts and the law. But I don't expect that there will be, well, we're going to do what they did and fire all of the people that were loyal to the previous president. But if those people make decisions that are not for the right reasons based on the facts and law, then there will be consequences. Now, that's my speculation. I don't know. Whoever is leading the department will make those decisions. But it should be hard to fire federal prosecutors and government lawyers. Like we have this tradition of an independent civil service that's apolitical. I frankly think that's a good idea, and that gets us more quality government. These jobs should not be subject to the vacillating whims of political change. They should rather be insulated from politics to the extent possible.
One of the things that I've been advocating for, and I suspect you may disagree with this, is that the next Democratic administration seeks to expand the Supreme Court, seeks to increase the number of federal districts, so that rather than trying to impeach judges, which is going to be, I think, nearly impossible, that we pack the courts in order to be more reflective of what most Americans believe. The Supreme Court, as of the day that this episode will come out, will have 1 week ago gutted civil rights legislation, and this is part of a pattern. And with so many young Supreme Court justices on the bench right now, I can only imagine that should the status quo remain, or maybe Alito or Thomas retire and Trump gets to insert two younger arch conservatives, that the Supreme Court will remain in conflict with the beliefs of mainstream Americans for a generation or more. Do you think that we should pack the court, or do you believe that the institution is is good as is?
Yeah, I strongly disagree with a lot of the recent decisions of the Supreme Court. Let's start with the immunity decision. Giving presidents immunity from criminal prosecution for things admittedly criminal done while in office or as official action is just wrong. The voting rights case that you mentioned, the Calais case that came out yesterday, there's a lot of principled disagreement that I and others have with the Supreme Court. That said, I don't know that packing the court is the right answer. I would like to see a more robust and fair confirmation process. I wish that the confirmation process was a more thorough vetting, that they were forcing nominees to actually answer questions about issues instead of saying that may come before the court and I won't. Right now, as you know, we have a very polarized and politicized nominations and confirmation process. That's not the way it's supposed to work. Genuine congressional oversight that focuses on capability and judicial philosophy over politics. It's fixing the institutions to make them work better, not finding workarounds to just add a bunch of new progressive judges. I worry that sets us up for more of a vacillating, well, we're in charge now, so there are 4 more Supreme Court justices, and maybe the next time we're not in charge, they pull those back or they add 4. Like, what we need to do is make institutions like the nomination and confirmation process work better, as opposed to constantly finding patches to fix them when they don't work like we want them. And I know that sounds kind of high-minded and idealistic, but I worry, and I feel a little bit of that on this redistricting front, right? Like, hey, he's packing state X with more Republicans. We got to respond to that. That's dangerous in my view, because that increasingly makes our politics even more polarized, makes those gerrymandered representatives less responsible to the people. There's less incentive to compromise. So instead of these Band-Aids, again, let's try to do more fundamental fixed institutions to make them work as envisioned.
What worries me about that is that is a complex solution. And I think as someone who's studied disinformation and the far right and figures like Steve Bannon and the effect that they have throughout the entire right-wing ecosystem, from Fox News and Wall Street Journal to the far right.
Yeah.
I worry that our nuanced, careful approach on the left is doomed to fail because we get stuck explaining things. And that I used to, I think, be an institutionalist. I went to Columbia University, the most influential professor that I had. I think I had a class with her every single year, was a hardcore institutionalist. And she was like close with Hillary Clinton. And I think, a decade ago, that's where my politics were. I was like, it's all going to work because these systems were designed to work and we have respect for these things. But over the last few years, I think that I have lost my faith in institutions in many of the same ways that you write about in your book. Extremists losing their faith, or as you call them, outsiders losing their faith in institutions. Do you really believe that these kind of nuanced, careful responses to excesses by the right in things like gerrymandering, in things like not packing the court, but certainly filling it with judges who are unqualified or clearly ideologues, is a careful, nuanced approach really going to work? Do you really believe that, or are you just committed to the institution?
No, I really believe that if, and this is an important if everybody participates, right? My assumption in that belief is that there are more good guys than bad guys, that there are more people of good faith who will do the right thing, who will make the right decisions, than there are extreme perspectives. The problem is that the reason that the Steve Bannons of the world have power, and the reason that we have these judges and we have the threats to democracy we have now, is that too many people are not engaged. So if everybody in America votes, if everybody in America educates themselves and tries very hard to get balanced perspectives, I think we're fine. To me, the real battle is not judges who are appointed by President Trump who issue bad decisions. It's the people that sit on their couch and say, they're all the same, so I'm not going to vote and I'm not going to pay attention. That is the biggest threat to democracy. I mean, I write in the book that if everybody is engaged, if everybody cares, if everybody sees themselves as having a personal obligation in the democracy to make it work, then I think it does work. And I think the institutions are animated by that. Politicians are more accountable. They do have to solve real problems. So to me, the focus ought to be on engagement, participation, getting everyone to care and to participate. Because I fundamentally believe that we have more in common than we have that separates us. The problem is that we give outsized power to these fringe perspectives because too many people just aren't paying attention. President Trump got 51% of the vote in 2024. 66% of registered voters even cast a ballot. So fully a third of the people in America who registered to vote stayed home. And that doesn't even touch, Kris, as you know, all of those 18 adults who didn't even register to vote. So this notion that he has gotten a landslide or that his points of view are widely popular, I just think that that's wrong. I think he has a very strong and fervent minority of people in America who are all in with him. But too many people, and then there's very strong, as you know, polarized people that are working against him. But then there are a lot of people in the middle who just are going to work and paying their taxes and taking care of their families. They need to get off the couch and get involved. And if they do, then I think our institutions will work better. So again, my assumption in making the argument to make institutions work better is that everybody's going to care about that, everybody's going to participate, and that is what gives me the confidence. If they don't, then the fringe perspectives are going to have outsized power, and that's what we're seeing is more and more threats to those institutions.
You write that apathy is far more dangerous than anger. While anger can be harmful, it can also be motivating. As you write, we got civil rights legislation because of righteous anger. I am someone who, as every one of my listeners knows well, I harness my anger. That is my primary motivating fuel. It's the thing that gets me up in the morning. It's the thing that gets me, it's what made me start infiltrating extremist organizations. It's what made me start studying disinformation, because I was angry at our democracy being eroded from outside forces and from within. But one of the things that I worry about when I look at anger as a motivating factor is that it can very quickly fade.
Yeah.
One of the toughest parts of my life, I got out of the Army in 2007 in a bad kind of way, severe PTSD, got involved in the anti-war movement. And in 2008, Obama was looked at by a large part of America as the solution.
Yeah.
And people were angry because of the financial crisis. People were angry because we had what then finally people started to realize were ongoing forever wars where there wasn't a clear exit strategy or, even a justified reason for going in the case of Iraq. Do you think that our country has learned from that, where we vacillated between, okay, everyone's getting out to vote. There's a massive surge in voter participation. Young people are coming out to vote in record numbers. Obama gets voted in, and then everybody goes back to the couch.
Yeah.
Do you? I think that it's very likely that history is going to kind of repeat itself on that front.
Yeah.
How do we keep people engaged beyond the anger and beyond the first win?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's really hard because I totally agree with you. I think what's going to happen, my optimistic version, is that all of the crazy that we are seeing now is going to prompt a very powerful backlash, right? You're seeing it with the No Kings protests and the Democrats getting elected in special elections, likely a midterm election that goes more favorably to Democrats. But with that comes an expectation that things will change, right? That things will get better. I was all in with President Obama, just very idealistic, enthusiastic. I served in his administration as U.S. attorney. And that sort of sense that we were in a post-racial America just wasn't there, right? And that then reinforces the cynicism that puts people back on the couch. So it is kind of a vacillating thing. Best case, that these last year and change in the next 2.5 years are going to prompt a more powerful movement or backlash. But with that comes responsibility to actually change. And I understand the cynicism. I understand why people say it doesn't really matter who I vote for Congress. They're not addressing gun violence and climate change and immigration and these hard problems. The way the system as currently constituted works is that it sort of is meant to protect incumbency more than encourage compromise. If you're a Democrat, the only way you lose is if someone's more progressive than you. If you're a Republican, the only way you lose is if someone is more conservative. And therefore, there's little incentive to actually come together and compromise. So that creates cynicism. So you have this is that what's going on now is outrageous. We have to vote. And then when you vote and you hope, if the reality doesn't match that, then people retreat again. Best case, I keep coming back to the optimism, is there is a recognition among outsiders now. And Democrats, in my view, have made this mistake in the past. There's a recognition now that we can't go back to the status quo. We have to reinvent how government works. I heard Pete Buttigieg recently say, Democrats can't run on, we're going to tape together the shards of a broken democracy. We have to actually reimagine how to put the pieces back together in a way that's more responsive, that's more accountable. And that's right. And for the last several cycles, Democrats have sort of been rope-a-doped by Trump because they just talk about how terrible he is without articulating, in my view, a more proactive vision about how a democracy really should work. So my hope is that losing is motivating and that people who are now on the outside don't just say he's terrible, we have to restore democracy, but they figure out how creatively how government has to be more responsive. Mm-hmm. Maybe that is unrealistic. Certainly historically, we've made progress, but it's been with fits and starts. I think we're due for a start, right? We're in the middle of a real fit, a real difficult challenge. My hope is that is motivating for engagement, and not just engagement temporarily, but engagement that reimagines how to make government more responsible.
You write in your book, and I can't remember the exact phrasing you use, so please correct me if I'm getting this wrong, about how you thought that your work with the January 6th committee would educate people, and you feel like perhaps that didn't work. I'm thinking about, 3 years from now, if Democrats win or we have some other reasonable president, if it's not a Democrat, Democrats controlling Congress, what do we do in the future that the January 6th committee was unable to do? Do we restructure the way that we investigate and potentially prosecute? Do we change the way that any investigating committee or commission has subpoena power? What are the mechanics of finding justice for all the damage that has been done? I am someone who I hope that Elon Musk, for example, is held accountable in some way for dismantling USAID, which has, by conservative estimates, already killed hundreds of thousands of people. That is, it doesn't meet the definition of genocide, but I don't know what other word to use to describe it. The intent, to me, seems really clear. Elon Musk comes from, the quotes from his father imply to me that he grew up in a household that was extremely racist. So I can only conclude that Elon Musk's obsession with destroying USAID is one of the first things, that it was his intent to kill black people in a way that the Unite the Right neo-Nazi rally goers could have only dreamed of. Is there accountability on the other end, or do these guys just get to walk away?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Let me start with the Jan 6 committee and then talk about accountability. So approaching the Jan 6 committee service, I always sort of assumed that, a third of the people in America already had concluded that President Trump, caused the riot and stoked insurrection. Another third of America completely blindly defended him and would not pay any attention to what we were doing. But there was maybe a middle third of people who were of good faith and open-minded, and that the work we did could persuade them. And I actually think that the work we did persuade a lot of people, but it wasn't as powerful of a evidentiary basis for a vote as their desire for change. Like, I believe there are a lot of people who credited the Select Committee's core narrative of January 6th, but voted for Trump anyway, because even though they disapproved of his rhetoric and the fact that it motivated a lot of angry people to storm the Capitol, he represented that hope of change. I think he was an outsider candidate and tapped into this cynicism about institutions. So there are a lot of people who said, he's responsible for January 6th, but I don't care, because at least he is going to change things. He's going to shake things up. So I don't look at the work that we did, the conclusions we made, as somehow like a failure. I also think there's a historical significance to a credible accounting of what happened. Now, going forward, part of the problem was that it was undertaken in a political process, right? If you remember, initially the proposal was for an independent 9/11 commission type process where you'd have experts appointed by politicians on both sides who would come together separate from the political process to focus solely on the riot. That was originally proposed, actually an agreement reached between Benny Thompson and John Katko, the Republican, on the Homeland Security Committee, and then Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell changed their minds, and it was then a select committee. And because it was done by members of Congress, I think for a lot of people it had less credibility, even though I think the facts themselves will withstand scrutiny. Congress really isn't equipped to do credible, careful investigations, like just the procedural mechanisms, like the tools that we had available made it more difficult. So that's not really the right place for accountability. And our purpose wasn't accountability, it was education of America about what happened. Now, to your question about accountability, absolutely. I do think that a functioning democracy and the rule of law requires accountability, requires people to be held accountable in some way, criminally if they've engaged in crimes, or politically if they've made decisions. There has to be accountability. And I worry that pardons, for example, right? Like, I believe that criminal consequences deter certain categories of criminal activity, that people make rational decisions that, hey, if it's risky for me to sell drugs or to rob this store, that deters them from making a criminal choice. But if you believe that, then the acceptance of or forgiveness of criminal conduct encourages that same behavior. And having wholesale pardons of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and all the people from January 6th, not to mention these supporters of the president, including like foreign leaders who were convicted of serious crimes, being pardoned for no good reason other than their support for this administration, that undercuts confidence in the rule of law. And that needs to change. There needs to be accountability, and that will hopefully help restore some faith in systems. It's part of why people are cynical, Kris, as we keep coming back to this. There's good reason why people don't believe in institutions, because a lot of times they don't work. So the answer to me is, let's make them work better. At least it's part of the answer. Let's make them work better. Let's find ways for some of the outrageous things that we have seen happen where there will be a reckoning and an accountability. And there are a lot of different ways for that. It could be the criminal justice system. It could be the ballot box. It could be lots of ways. But that really needs to be a priority of whomever comes next. Again, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, there has to be some way to have a system that promotes accountability.
Do you see that taking the form of a commission? Do you think Congress could even create a commission, or do you see something like a special counsel? I feel like a lot of Americans have lost faith in the idea of a special counsel. Aileen Cannon, basically just gutted Jack Smith's case. What what form can it take? Can I guess for context, like, I think a lot of decisions need to be investigated, like the self-dealing, the no-bid contracts for destroying half of the White House and building the ballroom. Can that fall under a special counsel's office? Does a commission do this? What is the actual mechanics of finding justice and finding the truth about this stuff?
Yeah, there's no one answer to that, right? There are a lot of different places where this could come, right? Let's say we had a functional Congress, a Congress that actually engaged in effective oversight. I was recently at an event with Jamie Raskin, who may be the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and he was asked, what are the priorities for the House Judiciary Committee if you are the chairman? And he said, corruption. There's so much going on in the current administration, the president enriching family business and the crypto tokens and this plane from Qatar and all the emoluments that, the sort of personal benefit. And he said, we'll bring a focus on that. We will issue subpoenas and we'll investigate. So Congress has a role in surfacing some of these things. If there is, again, a functional Congress that's focused on the right things. The criminal justice system is another one. If there are credible allegations of crime, they should be investigated. The immunity decision makes it harder, but I do think that the special counsel's case, based on January 6th and the classified documents, would have survived and gone forward even after the immunity decision, because so much of that conduct was outside of the official business of the president and was done as a candidate or done as a post-president with the possession of documents. So I do think even after immunity, there is some potential criminal accountability, again, assuming that there is evidence to support that. And then I do think on individual events where there is the need for intense focus, like a 9/11 or like an attack on the Capitol, creating special apparatus, an independent commission, a special counsel, where it needs more priority, it needs more resources, and there's any hint that the current Justice Department or Congress is not as credible because of political motivation, taking it out of that process and giving it to experts or independents, a Jack Smith or the 9/11 Commission. I do think will be a viable role for entities like that. So it's kind of a long answer to your question. Lots of different parts of our system will be able to evaluate facts and hold people and institutions accountable. And then sometimes we have to take it out of the current system and create something that is separate and expert-driven and independent.
Well, Tim, I only have you for another 2 minutes. I'm going to ask a loaded question, and I hope I can get a quick answer. You write about how the events of the Unite the Right neo-Nazi rally were kind of triggered by a high school student who started a petition to remove the Robert E. Lee statue. Should we tear down everything that Trump builds after he leaves office? If he gets his 300-foot monument between the Lincoln Memorial and the Arlington Cemetery, should we tear down the ballroom because they're all monuments to someone who is just so corrupt?
Yeah, no, we shouldn't tear down everything. We should tear down icons to ego. We should tear down things that are too costly or unwieldy or don't work. There ought to be accountability. There ought to be investigations. But no, the rule should not be everything that they did we're going to undo. That's only going to exacerbate this sense of division, right? There ought to be a careful, issue by issue, thing by thing, careful consideration of whether it has value or not, right? That would be my advice to whomever comes next. Again, I totally understand the urge to turn the page completely and throw everything with respect to the current group out. And I think a lot of it will be and should be thrown out. But I think it ought to be merit-based, not categorical, if that makes sense. Again, let's make decisions on the right reasons, not let's just do what they do and make decisions based on retribution or false information. Let's be smarter and do the right thing and take this issue by issue.
Tim, author of We Are the Answer, How to Save Democracy, Tim Heaphy, Thank you for joining us. I could talk to you so much more. I really appreciate you making the time. Please tell our listeners how they can follow you, how they can get your book, and what they can do to support your work.
Yeah, Kris, I appreciate that. The book's called We Are the Answer, How to Save Democracy. It's out on May the 19th. It's meant to be a very forward-looking prescription for how engaged Americans need to do their part. And it is meant to be optimistic. It's meant to be practical. There's a lot of suggestions in there for people who are a little bit adrift now and wondering how they should be contributing. It's available. There's an audiobook. It's available at bookstores on May the 19th. And look, I am a lawyer in private practice. It's Heaphy, Smith, Harbach, and Wyndham. Jack Smith, the special counsel, is my law partner, and we are engaged in an active investigations and litigation practice here in Washington, D.C. So if anybody has a need for those kinds of services, we are easily reachable in Washington, D.C. And Kris, I appreciate your interest. I appreciate the work you do, not just today, but every day. Having people on and talking about these important issues. You're part of helping people get engaged, which again is sort of the crucial currency of democracy. So thank you for what you do.
Thanks so much, Tim.
Thank you.
So here's where we land. Tim Heaphy believes the system still works. Only if people show up, if people stay engaged, if people decide that the rules still matter. I'm still wrestling with that because what we're seeing right now isn't just dysfunction. It's people in power testing how far they can push the system without facing any consequences. And so far, that's been incredibly harmful. We've seen American citizens executed in the streets by federal agents. We've seen concentration camps constructed here in the United States. We've seen countless kidnappings and disappearances, immigrants sent off to be tortured and die in prison camps in other countries. But here's the part that Tim is right about. Apathy is the accelerant. If you check out, if you assume it's already over, if you decide that your voice doesn't matter, then it becomes true. You don't have to agree with him and you don't have to agree with me, but you do have to decide where you stand. Do you believe the system can be fixed? Or do you think we're going to have to build something new? Either way, sitting this out isn't an option. If this conversation challenged you, do me a favor and share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Make sure that you subscribe to On Offense on Substack. That's where I'm putting the work that doesn't fit into the podcast alone. And be sure to subscribe wherever you do get your podcasts and to Valor Media Network on YouTube where you can watch every episode. And if you want to support what we do with the nonprofits, check out Task Force Butler Institute at taskforcebutler.org and Veterans Fighting Fascism at veteransfightingfascism.org. Because we're not backing down, despite everything that's going on. On Offense is produced by Gina Kim and edited by the Lombardos for Valor Media Network. I'm Kris Goldsmith, and I'll see you next time.